Jonathan Sacks, A Letter in the Scroll. In a couple of weeks, we'll start with a new book of his. We want to look at something from later in his career called The Great Partnership, which is really about the interrelationship, as he understands it, between science and faith, science and religion. It's a very interesting book, and we'll get a chance to look at that one starting a couple of weeks from now. But first, we want to finish up this one. So today is our last class on A Letter in the Scroll. I'll try to leave some time for questions. But as always, feel free to jump in or put something in the chat if you have a question. I want to start off where Rabbi Evan left off last week, which is the very end of chapter 14. We talked a lot about last week, and maybe took Rabbi Sacks to task a little bit for not necessarily speaking to the present moment in the Jewish community in America. We said, well, part of that is that, he was British, and the experience of Judaism in Britain is different than the experience of Judaism here in the United States. But I also think he was speaking to a particular time period here in the United States too, when he talks about ambivalence and assimilation. That may not be the issues that we're facing right now, but that doesn't mean they were never the issues here in the U.S. I mean, I think you can look at some of the writing of somebody like Philip Roth, for example, and see kind of questions of Jewish ambivalence in American society. Right? We mentioned Roth last week, but where he gets it right, I think, is the last line of that chapter, of chapter 14. And so, it's a little bit of a sidetrack to go off as we did last week and talk about interfaith marriage. I mean, what he thought it meant and what Rabbi Evan and I think it means are certainly different. But the last line, he says, what's wrong in Jewish life today is that we have forgotten, zis good zayin a yid. It's good to be a Jew, right? And I think that that's a point of view that Rabbi Evan and I both share. I've heard Evan say, and I've said it too, that we talk too much about the oi and not enough about the joy when we talk about Judaism. And when you ask that question that Rabbi Sacks asked at the beginning of why be Jewish, if our answer is only because we don't want to give Hitler a posthumous victory, which I think it was Emil Fackenheim said was the 11th commandment, right? That's not enough, right? It's certainly not enough. The farther we get away from the experience of the Shoah, the harder it would be to maintain a Judaism that is based sort of only on this negative, right? That we only preserve Judaism because we won't give in to hatred and anti-Semitism. So where I think Rabbi Sacks finishes off in these last two chapters is really about what gives him joy in being a Jew, what it means to him to be Jewish, how he answers that question that he starts with, why be Jewish? And it's more than just not giving in to the people who hate us, right? So it's interesting to think about, we have blessings that we say every day, according to tradition, the morning blessings. In our prayer book, they're referred to as the Nisim B'chol Yom. We thank God for the daily miracles. And one of those blessings, we say it at our Shabbat morning minyan for sure, is thank you, God, for making me a Jew, right? And this is not something we just wrote in the 21st century. I mean, this is something that Jews have been praying daily for centuries, right? And so that means that in times, in times of the Shoah, in times of the expulsion from Spain and the Inquisition, we were saying every day, thank you, God, for making me a Jew. When certainly it might have been easier to have been born something else, something makes me think of that line in Fiddler on the Roof, right? Where Tevye says to God, I know we're the chosen people, would you mind choosing somebody else once in a while, right? So that idea of that, we consider it a privilege, right? A joy to be a Jew is something that's deeply embedded in our tradition. So, I think that that's really an important part of the message that he wants to convey to us, is that this is not a burden, right? It's a privilege. And one of the stories that he tells, which is, again, I love particularly when he tells his own stories. He tells this story about leaving the synagogue in Great Britain and walking home with his father, and he has forgotten to take off his kippah. And someone, essentially another member of the congregation, so not an anti-Semite, right? Another Jew kind of confronts him and says, "Your son has forgotten to take off his kippah," right? And Rabbi Sachs's father, admonishes the man who says that, essentially, and says, "My son will wear a kippah wherever he wants to." Right? And again, I think there's an interesting British-American difference here too, which is maybe worth mentioning. I mean, it's not even just British. I think it's kind of a European difference. I mean, this was explained to me by a French rabbi who's a friend a few years ago when I was visiting Paris. So, in America, we celebrate freedom of religion. And in a lot of Europe, they celebrate freedom from religion. And there is a definite difference there, right? We don't live in a country that was ever really ruled by a church or a mosque, right? I mean, from the early days, the very earliest days of the American experiment, we have had freedom of religion, a decision that the government will never favor one religion over another. Now, how that works in practice, I mean, we're constantly in litigation about this stuff, right? Can an Orthodox Jewish member of the armed forces wear a kippah? And so things like that in America go to court. And the answer to that question, by the way, is yes, of course, an Orthodox Jewish member of the armed forces can wear a kippah, but he has to wear the military issued kippah, right? So the military actually created, there's one with camouflage. I mean, there's a couple of different military kippot. But so you can be in your American service uniform and wear a kippah, right? In France, it's considered to be almost disrespectful to wear a cross around your neck or to wear your kippah out of the synagogue and out on the street, right? Because it smacks, particularly the cross, in past generations, smacks of the time when the church ruled the country, right? And we have the Church of England in England doing that as well. So I will say that idea, I mean, it probably wouldn't occur to an American Jew to say to another American Jew, "Your son has forgotten to take off his kippah," right? Except perhaps in some places where anti-Semitism is rampant, but by and large, and even in those places, right, as I was saying at the beginning of this today, often the kippah is worn as kind of a badge of honor, right? We're going to wear a kippah, even if it's dangerous. So, but so the experience in Britain is slightly different there. It, by the way, also illustrates what's going on in France today. You may have followed some of the case about the hijab, right? Muslim women covering their faces, and there's such an uproar in France about this. And the one contextualizing element we have to put into that is that it has been, to use a French word, gauche, to wear your religious apparel in public, right? So that is part of the question about the hijab in modern, up-to-date France, right? So, but so the start of his conclusion, these last two chapters in the book, I think, are that there are many paths to empathy and understanding. there are many ways to build the covenantal relationships that he talks about, but this is ours. And that's the title of chapter 15, right? So he believes in certainly the dignity and the beauty of other faiths and other traditions. He tells that story, which is perhaps you've heard in other contexts, of the two men. This comes from the Talmud, I believe. Two men, one who's accustomed to carrying diamonds every day, and one who's accustomed to carrying heavy stones every day. And then one day they're both assigned to carry emeralds, right? And the one who has been carrying stones sees emeralds as just another kind of stone. The one who carries diamonds sees the emeralds as something beautiful and different and rare. And so he suggests that those who believe that they're carrying diamonds when they're taking care of their Judaism, right? When they see other people of faith from other traditions, they see the emeralds, right? They see the great beauty of other traditions. If all we see is a burden, if all we see that our Judaism is a burden to us, then all faith looks like a burden to us, and we can't understand the beauty of anything. Okay? So it's an interesting point, and but his point by and large is that there are many paths, many ways to be holy, many paths to holiness. This is the Jewish path, and for Jews, this is our path. For those who choose Judaism, this is their path. So whether it's by birth or temperament or marriage or choice, then follow that path because it's your path, right? And following that path leads not to the burden, but to the joy of Judaism. So in chapters 13 and 14, he kind of, he goes into the painful history, the Shoah and those things. But in 15 and 16, where he's looking to the future, he wants to reclaim a joyous future. And he uses the story of Jacob wrestling with God, an angel himself, whatever that story may be, as a kind of metaphor for how we go forward, right? That that it's up to each of us to be authentically who we are by having our own wrestling match, right? Our own wrestling match with faith, with God, with Judaism, whatever it might be. He's not the first person to use this metaphor. Rabbi Arthur Waskow used it before this book was published in a book called God Wrestling, where he suggests that that's what all Jews are. Every one of us is a God wrestler. There's also, he then published a sequel a while later, was God Wrestling Round 2. So, because wrestling matches like boxing matches don't have just one round, right? We all have, it's a part of that culture of debate and questioning, right? The wrestling match is actually not something that's painful and difficult, but something that's powerful and important and meaningful. And meaning leads to joy, right? To an authentic kind of experience of happiness. So, and then he goes back to essentially to the title, to a letter in the scroll and what that might mean. So, he talks about what happens to us if we abandon this task, if we choose not to enter the ring, and to if we choose not to enter the ring and have our wrestling match. It says on page 212, if Jews are no longer Jews, there's a missing voice, an empty place in the conversation of mankind. And I think that that's another way of getting at what he's been saying, that a letter is missing from the scroll. And when that happens, the whole scroll, right? We have 11 Torah scrolls at Makom Saleh Lakeside. A couple of them probably are not kosher for reading. if a letter falls out of the scroll, it's no longer kosher, right? And that happens. I mean, they wear over time. I mean, we have our scroll that was rescued from the Shoah. I think it's been examined in relatively recent times, but that's a very old scroll. We have an old scroll that was part of Legacy Lakeside's collection, the first one that was given to the congregation back in 1955, but it was probably 50 years older than that. So, so we have a couple of scrolls that are over 100 years old. Chances are that a letter or two has fallen out of them. I mean, that's what happens over time. And when that happens, according to tradition, the scroll is pasul. You can't take it out and use it for a kosher Torah reading, right? Now we have many scrolls to choose from, so we don't have to worry about that in any way. But the interesting idea that he's bringing is that if one of us falls out of the scroll, if our letter is missing, then in a sense the whole scroll is pasul. It can be fixed, but it's not whole until it is fixed, right? And so it's up to us to be who we are, to be authentically who we are. And this is where I think he sounds, in some ways, though he's passionately Orthodox and really trying to make an argument, I think, that we have to follow every one of the mitzvot, all 613. But I would draw the more general inference that I think he also really says is that, you can see the beauty in everybody's experience, right? And so, we may follow mitzvot our own way. We may choose particularly the moral and ethical mitzvot, as that was sort of the hallmark of Reform Judaism of the 19th century, and pay less attention to cheeseburgers and shrimp and things like that, but that doesn't make us less authentically Jewish, and we remain a letter in the scroll. So, there are a couple of things that he points to about how doing that, being authentically ourselves, allows us to see the beauty in everybody else's experience, right? I could point to a few quotes. My couple that I like, page 214, he says, arrogance diminishes others, pride values others. So we should have pride in being Jewish. Pride values others because we have learned to value ourselves. And so, when we see the value in our own faith, we see the value in others. There's the story he tells on page 214, which ends with this idea: if they call me a Jew, I will take it as an insult. If they call you a Jew, you will take it as a compliment, right? And so that's Rabbi Sacks. If someone calls me a Jew, I will not be insulted by that. I will be joyful that I've been recognized, right? For who I am and what I believe. So, and then he gets to his last chapter, why I am a Jew, and I think he summarizes this at the very end of the chapter, but he starts with Albert Einstein on page 216. You may know that the state of Israel actively was looking for Albert Einstein to be the first president of the state of Israel, but he declined those days. So a different scientist, Chaim Weizmann, took the position, but Einstein was certainly authentically Jewish in his way. And he said, the pursuit of knowledge for its own sake, an almost fanatical love of justice, and the desire for personal independence. These are the features of the Jewish tradition which make me thank my stars I belong to it. So this is a sentence put into a book by an Orthodox rabbi from a Jew who was not a practicing Orthodox Jew, right? So, but pointing to the same things that Rabbi Sacks sees as some of the great elements of Judaism that are so important to him. And I love the language of it, the pursuit of knowledge for its own sake, right? This is actually what all of you are doing, which, right? No one gets a degree from coming to these classes. Hopefully we learn something. We have a word for it in Hebrew. We call it Torah Lishma, which is Torah for its own sake, just because learning is good, right? And then the almost fanatical love of justice, just bordering on, the fanatical, right? I think that's a nice turn of phrase from Einstein. And then the desire for personal independence, which is, I think, a hallmark certainly of Reform Judaism, Judaism in general, but Reform in particular, yes? So these are the features of the Jewish tradition which make me thank my stars I belong to it. So what Einstein doesn't mention there, Sachs mentions on the next page. I think on page 218, the restless drive to perfect the world under the sovereignty of God is a Jewish instinct that survives long after other practices have been abandoned. He may be speaking to Reform Judaism there, where, the founders of Reform Judaism back in the 19th century set at the top of their agenda the prophetic ideal, right? They often called it prophetic Judaism, that derived from the message of Isaiah and Amos and the other prophets. They wouldn't have used in the 19th century the Hebrew phrase that has become everywhere these days, tikkun olam. I've heard presidents of the United States use the phrase tikkun olam. So I think it's if it hasn't quite entered the English vocabulary in America, I mean, it's definitely entered the political vocabulary. But that's when he says it's an instinct that survives long after other practices have been abandoned. I mean, that's his view of reform, right? And we shouldn't have abandoned those things from his point of view. Certain practices, women wearing pants and things like that. But nevertheless, I would say that embedded in that sentence is he sees us as Jews, right? Judaism expects great things of its adherents. A people who saw themselves as a kingdom priest could do no less. And high expectations give rise to high achievements. And I think that that's certainly something that we see in our present day world, right? I mean, a lot of people have been talking about the fact that in the current presidential administration in America, I mean, we seem to have a minion, right? It's quite a remarkable thing when you think about it. So high expectations do indeed lead to high achievements. Now, I would encourage us not to get too chauvinistic about that, right? Every now and then I get this email. You've probably gotten it. It goes around every now and then about all the Jews that have won Nobel Prizes and how remarkable that is. And it is indeed a remarkable achievement that we should be proud of. But we can get a little chauvinistic about that. When I get that, I usually write back to people and say that if they were giving out Nobel Prizes in the 9th century, all of the winners would be Muslims, right? The poetry, the science, the mathematics, the philosophy of Islam was the top of the world in those days, right? So we just happen to be lucky in a certain sense that the Nobel Prize doesn't get developed until the late 19th, early 20th century. So this has been a time of great success for us. but there's no question that he's right. I think that high expectations give rise to high achievements, and so that's something we should admire about our tradition. Um, and let's see. So I made a lot of notes on page 221. Let me see if I can decipher my own handwriting here. But on page 221, it seems clear to me that he gets the problem, right? He gets the problem, which is the sense of, and this is perpetuated in many, many ways. I don't want to necessarily get political about it, but, I was talking to someone who works for Jewish Federation a couple of years ago, and I don't necessarily want to I don't want to throw anybody under the bus, but he said it's really hard to raise money for Jewish education. He said I can raise money to fight anti-Semitism any day of the week, but raising money for synagogues, for education, that's much harder, you know? And so we've built a kind of a fundraising complex, which is based on what the oys rather than the joys, right? It's always easier to fundraise on the oys, and that's a problem for us. So so he gets that problem, but I think he gets a bit distracted when he attributes it all to assimilation and intermarriage. So our problem is no longer wrestling with God. Our problem is that we have a lot of people who are sure that there is no God. And, ask any of the 13-year-olds who are becoming B'nai Mitzvah, right? Not many of them will confess to a belief in God. Now, for me, I believe partly that's a phase, right? That this is part of the questioning that our tradition actually asks of them, and some of them will come through that to the other end. Others will not. But and our problem as Reformed Jews is not knowing what we've left behind, right? And this is something that's worth thinking about, right? The early reformers in the 19th century, remember, they all came out of a very traditional milieu. Many of them were among the great rabbinic scholars of their days, right? And they knew a lot of this material backward and forward, and then they rebelled, right? Generations later, it's not exactly it's not the same kind of rebellion, right? If our kids don't know what tefillin are, much less how to put them on, they can't rebel against the tradition, right? So it makes sense to me that this is part of our Torah Lishma, is to learn what it is we're rebelling against, right? What we're reforming. So we go out of our way to say that we are not reformed, that reform is a present tense verb, and that we are continuing to reform. But what we're reforming is what we've already reformed, right? We're not necessarily going back to tradition and reforming that tradition. Right? Now, sometimes we do, but mostly we're not, right? Mostly, we're saying, well, we used to do this, now we're going to do that, right? We're not really going back to basics in a certain sense. So this week we celebrate Purim. The Torah, there's a special Torah reading before Purim. We read the story of Amalek, right? One of the historical enemies of Israel. Amalek is particularly despised because he attacked the Israelites as they were leaving Egypt, and he attacked them from behind so that he could attack the women and the children, the elderly, the stragglers of the people. And we're taught that Haman in the Purim story is a descendant of Amalek. And the curious phrase that's there is, we have a command, the mitzvah, to remember to wipe out the memory of Amalek, right? So in every generation, we're supposed to remember to forget Amalek. This is a paradox, right? And so first you have to know who Amalek is, and then you can forget about him. So if you don't know who he is, you can't forget about him, right? That's in some ways the parallel to what's going on with Reform Judaism, right? We don't know what it is that we are rebelling against, right? So getting towards the end of his book, just on page 222, one more place where I want to take him to task before we finish with the great beauty of his conclusion. On page 222, he has a sentence, he says, ethnicity carries no obligations, culture does not command. And I don't think that that's true. So, I mean, I think that, he may be answering a particular thing. Mordecai Kaplan, the founder of Reconstructionist Judaism, wrote a book called Judaism as a Civilization. He rather famously rewrote the prayer book to remove God from the prayer book. He was more of a humanist than a theist, but Kaplan really said that the only thing that commands in the 20th century and now the 21st is the culture, right? Because even those of us who believe in God may not believe in a God as commander, right? I mean, that is a very orthodox position to take, that there are 613 commandments and every one of them is commanded by God and it's up to us to do them, right? So anyone who doesn't think that relates to the commandments in a different way. And so it's the culture that commands, not God, right? It's what we as a people have decided are important, right? So it's important to remember that we decide what the cultural minhag is, the custom for our particular community, and history is replete with minhagim from different parts of the Jewish world that are completely culturally bound, right? We made Hamantashen yesterday. In Greece, we said it's Haman's hat. Sometimes, I mean, really, that's a euphemism, right? Because I think Tashin are ears, actually. So it's really Haman's ears, but that seems a little barbaric, so we turned it into Haman's hat, But in Greece, the Jews eat Haman's feet. It's a completely different pastry. It's I don't know what to compare it to. It's a little more like halva. It's like ground nuts and things like that, and it's often cut into the shape of feet or shoes, actually. So it's these things are cultural minhagim, right? So Sephardic Jews do one thing and Ashkenazic Jews do another. They're not ordained by God, even by those who believe that things are ordained by God, right? There are still these things that they do. There's someone was telling me about a synagogue in Europe where when you go into the synagogue, everybody bows their head, right? Which is not really done in Jewish tradition. Only this synagogue. So why is it done? Because they used to have a door that was only 4.5 feet tall. So everybody coming in had to bow their head. Then they built a new synagogue, got a beautiful, glorious door. Everyone bows their head when they come to it, right? This is not ordained by God. This is a cultural command. So I do think that culture does command, and in some ways, it's the only thing that commands in the 21st century. Culture itself is a covenant that we enter. And we have that covenantal relationship with the culture. And so finally, and then leave a few minutes if folks have some questions or want to summarize it differently than I have. I mean, he writes his summary on the last few pages, pages 227 to 229. He kind of goes through there was a litany like this, I think, written in the 19th century. I'm not sure, I can't remember the name of the author. It certainly appeared in the last edition of the Reform Movement's prayer book. I think it may be somewhere in the new one too, but it's I am a Jew because, and it goes through, I don't know, 7 or 8 things. So he does exactly the same thing. So he's borrowing that language in a sense, but on those last few pages, he says, why then am I a Jew? And then he goes through a few paragraphs. I am a Jew because I am a stage on its journey, a connecting link between generations. Something we often say at bar mitzvah as we pass the Torah from one generation to the next. We talk about being links in a chain. And I like to say to the kids, you're the next link in that chain, right? You'll pass this on to the generation that comes after you. And then he says, I am a Jew because human life is sacred, that the individual may never be sacrificed for the mass, and that rich and poor, great and small, are all equal before God. That almost fanatical commitment to justice, if you like. I am a Jew because I'm the moral heir of those who stood at the foot of Sinai and pledged themselves to live by these truths, becoming a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. So the morality of it, the idea of that covenantal relationship with God. And they said, I'm a Jew because of Shabbat, the world's greatest religious institution. I'm a Jew because our nation never gave up on its commitment to helping the poor or rescuing Jews from other lands or fighting for justice for the oppressed. Right? I am a Jew because I cherish the Torah in words, texts, teachings, and commands. Though they lacked all else, Jews never ceased to value education as a sacred task, endowing the individual with dignity and depth. So again, this commitment to education, this commitment to high expectations. Right? I am a Jew because of our people's passionate faith and freedom. So, so in each of these things, he's saying, this is it. I am proud simply to be a Jew. Right? Because we have never stopped traveling in searches and searching. In our uniqueness lies our universality. Though being what we alone, through being what we alone are, we give to humanity what only we can give. And that's essentially his conclusion, right? The Judaism is a unique voice. It's one of many beautiful faiths in the world, one of many paths to holiness, certainly. But it is our path, and it's a beautiful path. There's nothing else quite like it. And so as each of us is a letter in the scroll, each faith in the world, in a sense, is its own, if we're all letters, maybe they're chapters or books or something like that, But if any faith were to disappear for some reason, right, it would be a tragedy. Because to understand God, we need all of the voices, right? All of the different possibilities. And so, so with that, I remind each of us that we are a letter in the scroll, that our faith is part of the scroll. So. Sorry. So with that, I'll finish, and we've got about 15, 18 minutes for questions and conversation if anyone's got something they'd like to add. Any thoughts?
The ones that you say don't come out of the other side, that don't believe in God,
Yeah,
are they still Jewish?
absolutely, 100%. Yeah, yeah. And Judaism doesn't really command belief, right? I mean, uh, not in that sense. Now, when I get to have those conversations, both with kids and adults, I mean, one of the first questions I ask is, "Tell me about the God you don't believe in." Because the God that they don't believe in usually is a God I don't believe in either, right? So when people say they don't believe in God, it's usually because they have a narrow idea of what they think God is, right? Because we know that God doesn't work the way the Torah seems to suggest, right? The only good happens to good people, only bad happens to bad people. Doesn't work that way, right? So if the only idea of God that you have in your head is a God that hurls down lightning bolts when you do the wrong thing, right? Or a God who cares whether or not you eat a cheeseburger, you know, that it we all kind of reject that God, I think, you know. Um, when when Harold Kushner wrote his book, the title is significant, right? Remember, the title is "When Bad Things Happen to Good People." It's not why bad things happen to good people, because that's not the question. The question is, what do we do when it happens? Because it does, right? So, so I like to open up that conversation with students of all ages, right? What's the God you don't believe in? And because sometimes there's perhaps there, right? That's worth thinking about, you know?
Rabbi,
Yeah.
if I may, first of all, I want to thank you and Rabbi Evan for doing this and for all the classes, because I was somebody who sat in religious school for many, many years, from the time I was 6 years old, and went every Sunday, and then went through confirmation and everything. And of course, was one of those who, didn't really know much about God, and tried very hard not to pay any attention when I was in Sunday school. And it's only since I'm an adult, and I've been doing Torah study ever since I joined Legacy Solel, I think 24 years ago, and that I feel like I missed so much that I'm getting as an adult.
Bless you.
And I'm very grateful for this. I think it's really good.
Well,
And
thank you very much.
I know why I'm a Jew, because I do get joy from it.
Yeah, that's right. That's great. I am always so moved in our Torah study group just by the wealth of knowledge I was going to say in the room, but I guess in the Zoom, and also the folks who, are a generation older than us, Sue, who are, the people in their 90s who are there, right? And have been studying Torah in some cases for 70 years, right? And keep coming to Torah study every week. Right? I mean, that's so inspiring to me. I mean, this idea that, a reminder every week that there's something else still there. There's something more to learn, that there's new depths that we can get to when we study these things. So, so I love that, That's why even when Rabbi Evan's teaching it and I could sleep in, I like to join in.
Well, I'm honored. What, Sue, what you kind of said reminds me, in many ways, Judaism is kind of an adult religion. It's in that it's hard to appreciate a lot of the teachings when you're in religious school and Sunday school. And so it's kind of sad when people give up on Jewish education after that, because there is just so much richness that you can only really appreciate as an adult. And it takes an act of will. It takes will and desire to go through and do it. But when you do, as you expressed, it's so rewarding and joyful. And
this is a statement worthy of, Arnie Wolf. I think I may even have heard it from him, but I used to say it a lot too, which is, we really should close the religious school to the kids and open it to the parents.
good idea. Yeah.
Yeah. In an ideal world, right? That's what it'd be. You'd teach parents to teach their kids.
That's right. Yeah, that is something he would definitely
Yeah,
say.
doesn't it sound like Arnie? I
No
think I may have
question.
gotten it from him.
No question.
Mhm. Other thoughts?
Rabbi, it's Alice.
Yeah, hi.
I couldn't help but thinking, I don't know, you were talking about, accepting who we are, and building on that. And I'm starting to do some stuff with meditation. And that's one of the things that's talked about is you have to start with loving yourself. And I think that what you said really resonated with me, that, whoever you are, whatever you believe, you got to start there, and then you could move on to other people in the greater world. So that really, really spoke to me when you said that.
That's great. Thank you. There's a lot of literature out there about Jewish meditation these days. I don't know if you're looking at any of this stuff, but Aryeh Kaplan of blessed memory wrote probably the first book about this, which was simply called Jewish Meditation. But since then, there have been many more. I mean, Rabbi David Cooper, Shani Leibowitz, half a dozen more that I can't think of the names of. If you want to ask me offline sometime,
Sure. A group of us are doing music and meditation with Cantor O'Brien. So that, that's part of it. And so again, what you just said today really resonated with what we've been talking about in that class too.
That's great. I love when that happens.
Yeah.
Anything else going on? Yeah, Merle? You have to unmute.
Actually, I have a question for both Rabbi Ike and Rabbi Evan. At what age did you know that you wanted to be a rabbi?
Evan, you want to go first? Go ahead.
Sure. It was always in the back of my mind. I think probably from the time of my bar mitzvah, when I had wonderful role models, Rabbi Ike, of course, and Rabbi Shapiro in Milwaukee. I was also, when we lived in Houston, I went to a Jewish day school, so I kind of had that as a really grounding experience. But it definitely wasn't certain. I thought it really came together probably towards the end of college, when I was at first I thought maybe I'd get a PhD. And then quite honestly, I thought, I don't know if I really want the lifestyle of a professor. They were in school a lot and didn't seem to, it was a struggle. The lifestyle wasn't as wonderful as I would hope. And they also kind of discouraged us, which I actually am grateful for. They essentially said, and they were right, because one of my best friends ended up getting a PhD in American history from Harvard. Brilliant guy. But it's very hard to get good jobs in that field. It's extremely difficult. So it's kind of deciding between a PhD, going to law school, and the rabbinate. And what I realized was being a rabbi kind of combined everything that I loved. Teaching, working with people, community building, learning, all of that kind of seemed like it was a wonderful combination of so many different things. And I was lucky. I had great role models, that I think is a true blessing. And then it was really after college, I spent a year working at the Religious Action Center of Reform Judaism. And there were 6 of us all out of college. Half became rabbis and half became lawyers. So I figured that was a perfect job to kind of confirm my decision. And honestly, I am so grateful. I feel like, to do something that you love is a real gift, so it was really in college that it all came together.
So when Rabbi Evan talks about it, it sounds like a very rational decision, when you talk about it, and my decision definitely comes more from the non-rational. I've told this story before, and perhaps some of you have heard it, but just there was a day I mean, when I was preparing for my bar mitzvah, the first day that I actually read from a Torah scroll, I went to a huge congregation. It was about 1,800 families. They had a bunch of basically anonymous tutors. I have no idea who this Israeli who, had been hired to teach some bar mitzvah kids brought me into the sanctuary, and I stood in front of the Torah for the first time. And I just felt like I was standing in the place where I was supposed to stand. And then after that, then I had the intellectual, right? So after that, it was like, so from the time I was 12 years old, I was thinking about, okay, so what do I have to do in order to be a rabbi? Well, I have to get an undergraduate degree. What's a good major for someone who wants to go to rabbinic school, right? Things like that. I went through a few choices before I landed on one. And then actually took a little time off in college and worked as a bookkeeper actually for a year. So, and that's when it was coming back from that decided that, yeah, this is really the calling for me. So I felt a sense of, the language is hard to come by, but to borrow from other traditions, I felt a call early. I felt the presence of God in my life in that moment on the bima, and kind of started the process. Took a few winding turns in between there and rabbinic school, but I had reason to look back at my old high school yearbook the other day, and there's all these signatures in it from people who say, you're going to make a very interesting rabbi one day. So I didn't even realize I was that, I don't remember being that open about it with friends, but.
Did you have the beard and the yarmulke yet?
No, I definitely did not, So I was long-haired, I had hair out to here, actually. I had the class of Bufo back in those days. So, but anyway, so that's how we got here. So we're coming to a close. So I want to thank you all for coming out and being a part of this. And as I said, in a couple of weeks, we're going to start a different book by Rabbi Sachs. So I think 2 weeks from today, called what's it called, Evan?
The Great Partnership.
Thank you.
It's beautiful. It's a beautiful book.
Yeah. So about, as I mentioned at the beginning, science and religion. So it's a different take, but really an interesting work by Rabbi Sachs as well. So I hope you can come back and join us. And thanks for being here.
Same time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.
Thank you both very much.
Thank you.
Terrific.
Very good.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, rabbis. Thank you.
There it is. I always see your name.
Thank you.
All the work.
Mm.